They're tapping in most intimately into this story. And because they are getting this access, this behind the scenes intimate look into the brain of particular characters and how they work, this gives them a chance to hang out and inhabit their world. Readers project themselves into the story, and it's precisely because of this intimate connection and investment that they begin to care. It's hard to have empathy if you don't care.
I'm Jeffrey Colon. This is Talk by Turner. Talk by Turner dives deep into the intellectual discovery while examining what's happening in our world right here, right now, with topics ranging from screenwriting and modern dating to climate politics and how horror stories impact culture. Talk is for everyone. Whether you're new to something or you want to hear more about a subject you've always loved, join us each week to hear from published authors and industry experts as they share their knowledge and insight. Now let's check out who's on this week's episode. Allison Alsup, welcome to Talk by Turner.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey.
All right, so big question, because there is a movie out there that's probably going to win a lot of awards for historical fiction. You know, what made you gravitate towards writing historical fiction in the first place?
I feel like that question is synonymous with asking, why are you a hopeless nerd? You know, it's just, some of us are born this way. I will say that another way of thinking of that question is that all of us are interested, I think, in the mysteries of those things that came before us. Historical fiction writers are those who are so interested in that they're willing to do the extra work that it takes to write historical fiction. So in addition to everything else that you have to do in writing a novel, creating the story, creating the characters, understanding the conflict, on top of all of that is this extra layer of responsibility of doing research. And that takes a lot of time. So that's for us. Maybe we're suckers, gluttons for punishment. There might be that as well.
And that story that you wrote, the book is called Foreign Seed. You know, your novel focuses on a historical mystery, you know, but also on real historical figures. So, you know, how do you balance that, you know, it makes it so it's both intriguing, but also involving, you know, real historical moments?
Is the question really, how do you balance the idea of staying true to the facts, but also giving yourself permission to use imagination?
So let's think about people who might say, you know, I'm not that into history that much. I'm not really into historical analysis that much. You know, what would you say to those people who aren't typically interested in learning about history? How do you get people to be more interested in it, especially during a time like the present right now?
Yeah, people can be very absorbed. There's a lot to learn about our current time. But I would say that in history, you know, the word story is in the word history. And I have yet to meet the person who isn't interested in a good story. So sometimes they fail to see or can't quite grasp initially how a story may apply to their lives. In which case, I would say start with that. Start with something close to home, something about where you're from your family, something that is interesting to you about your occupation, a passion of yours. But a good story and a good piece of historical fiction will not only talk about the specifics of details of that time, which keeps it fresh and interesting. I once heard Jennifer Egan, the famous writer, who's one very, very successful, very famous, say that historical fiction was the closest thing to time travel that we have. I truly feel that. So with historical fiction, you can disregard all of the things that you had to do in history class, where there was grades and tests and only one right answer, and you were really concentrating only on the facts. What is great about historical fiction is that we focus on the story, the history, the facts, the details. It's all in the service of a story, and hopefully one that readers find universal. You know, we still have the same brain that we had for millennia. So what people were doing 100 years ago, 200 years ago, they still had the brain that we have now. They were moved by the same emotions, motivations. The packaging of their lives looks different, and that keeps it interesting for us. That's that little time travel part. But stories, historical fiction, I think we can often recognize ourselves in them.
You know, when we think about historical events, a lot of times when we are presented those from like an educational standpoint, it's boiled down to being very black and white in terms of the narrative.
Right.
You know, there's not a lot of ambiguity. There's not a lot of nuance. There's not a lot of context. Would you say your novel challenges this idea? And if so, you know, how?
Right. I agree with you. The way that history is often taught is specifically about regurgitating facts. And one thing that historical fiction really does is ask us to think about the significance of those facts, right? Also, I would say that history is often taught about huge events, right? Wars and massively known iconic figures that have shaped history. One thing that historical fiction can do is break away from that and get into what would a more regular person, what their life might have been like. So an ordinary person, but in extraordinary circumstances, and that's what makes for that novel. But to your question about kind of this factual base, yes, no, true, false, what's the date, the location, all of that kind of concrete detail. War and Seed, my novel, absolutely challenges that. What began as a mystery, and I think most mystery writers proceed this way, is kind of through a series of clues and facts towards an ultimate closure, tidying things up, came to really be challenged when I was writing this book and trying to stay somewhat true to that story. But I wanted to remain true to the facts of the case. That said, the facts of the case did not necessarily lend themselves to 100% clarity. So I knew from the get-go that I was going to have to give myself some permission and leeway to fulfill, in my mind, my own interpretation. I also became interested in the idea, and I write about this in the afterword of the book, this concept that we now called ambiguous loss. My book is set in 1918. That term would not have been out there in psychology circles. It is now. But it is very true to the human experience that we don't always get clear-cut closure and resolution. You live any time on this planet and something of significance will happen to you for which there will be no clear-cut, tidy, all tied up in a bow ending. And I really wanted to pay homage to that part of our experience as human beings, of what do we do in the face of that, even when we desperately ruminate, seek, obsess, try our damnedest to find those answers. How do we come to a place of being able to live with that uncertainty? That certainly comes in my novel in the case of the protagonist's younger brother, who is an invented character, an invented situation of my imagination, who is missing as a pilot in World War I.
You know, what's your research process like when you think about, you know, this is different from just writing plain out fiction, because you have to go and actually sort of look at history and how that's going to fit into your entire narrative. I mean, what's that process like? Take our listeners, viewers through a little bit of that.
That's right. So I would say this is the part where you have to have a bit of dopamine, get off of your duffers, and you have to do the extra work. So the research of this was pretty time consuming. And if I'm very honest here, Jeffrey, at no point in the writing of this book did I feel like, oh, I've got this. I know it all. At every single turn, there was more to learn. I was not an expert of any facet of this book, not of World War I, not of botanical exploration, not of Chinese history, not of what it would be to be my character as a vice consul in the consular service, none of these things. And so I had to learn step by step, all of it. I was quite overwhelmed, and at many points I thought, Allison, this book is beyond you. You just don't have the knowledge base to do it. Slowly and surely, I went through that. Some of the things that I used and that can be very, very helpful are, of course, primary documents. So one of the most useful items for this book is that the actual Samuel Sokoban, who my character is based on, who was the vice consul who was sent upriver to find the missing American explorer Frank Meyer. His original report, is about 8.5 pages long, typed on an onion skin. It's crumbling apart now, but but it survives in the National Archives. So I went to the archives, I read that original report. I was also able to see photographs, letters, inventories, all sorts of primary documents that Frank Meyer himself had created and now are in the archives. Photographs, I mined them for every sort of detail. And that extended to things like what did airline, air pilots, flyers is what they were called during World War I. What did they look like? What were they wearing? In my novel, for instance, I'll give a small detail. There's so many Chesterfield cigarettes. They were the first waterproof cigarette, and they were very popular because of that with soldiers in the trenches. But also in almost every photograph that I saw of flyers from World War I, they're in their gear, right? They've got their caps, they've got their scarves, they've got their heavy trench coats on. There's an airplane in the background and a cigarette in their hand. And so it's details like that that can really, just one little detail in a photograph or in a postcard or a letter or a diary entry that can lead you down, if you really allow it to, and can influence the writing of the novel.
Let's pivot to current events. So if we look at current and cultural events, the political environment that's around us, does that directly impact what you choose to write about? And if so, in what way?
Yeah. Historical fiction has to do two things, Jeffrey, that I think are at odds, or may seem as though they are at odds with one another. One of this is the time travel aspect, to get us deliberately out of the time that we live in now. And that is not just our time, but also the setting sometimes. So this is 1918 China. And at first that feels like this huge gap, right? And that's part of the appeal, is that very difference, that very otherness, right? That we're going on an adventure in space and time. On the other hand, if historical fiction only remains in the past and it doesn't have this connection, as you're alluding to the present, then it's not going to connect with modern audiences. It's not going to connect with the reader. So there has to be a way in which, whether or not it is overt or indirect, that this storyline is going to appeal and connect to a modern audience. One of those things was this idea of ambiguous loss. That absolutely appealed. But when I was looking at the events and what was going on in the novel, there wasn't a single thing that wasn't still happening, right? Warring nations, check, we still have that. Anti-Semitism, check, we still have that, right? Lapses of faith, people trying to reconcile evil or terrible things in the world with their faith, check. Men still acting badly in ill-fated love affairs towards their lovers, yes, check, that's still going on. There was a single thing, what I was writing about, that did still apply today. So while it's not necessarily inspired by a specific event today that I see a counterpoint to in the past, it's not, for instance, it's not inspired by a specific legislation or policy. All of these people are still doing them today. It still resonates. So this is one question I've been really excited to ask you as a fellow creative artist empath. Yep. How can creativity and art encourage people to have more empathy, especially, with people from different cultures? And of course, I ask this because empathy is on that list of traits or characteristics that the World Economic Forum says is really important for the 21st century. I think every writer has to exhibit empathy for all their characters. You spend a lot of time with them, and you have to not just know what they've done, you have to know the reasons why they might have done that, born of their experience that is particular to them, their thoughts, their emotions, and their motivations. So I would say the act of writing well, right, of really fully going there, is in and of itself an attempt to understand others, to often bridge cultural divides. This book is not looking like my life. My protagonist is male. He works in the government. He identifies culturally as Jewish, even if he's had a lapse of faith. None of those things apply to me. Another important character in this book, and that I think really speaks to your question, is his interpreter, Mr. Lin. Mr. Lin is a dark horse character that we don't realize in the beginning of the book how important he's going to be, but he will travel upriver. Sukoban and Mr. Lin will be strangers at the beginning of the book. They've never worked together, but over the course of this intensive experience that they have, they come to understand one another. Even though they begin as strangers and don't recognize all that they have in common, they will come to realize that they have more in common than they ever knew. And a real close relationship over the course of that week will begin. When we read, we have this opportunity to always investigate empathy. It's not the same as reading an article for facts or information. Reading is very specific. It's an intimate act where a reader sits down or lies down and alone envisions this world based on the clues and the language, the details that the writer has applied to them. But that book is going on in their head, in their consciousness, in their brain, in their nervous system, right? They're tapping in most intimately into this story. And because they are getting this access, this behind the scenes intimate look into the brain of particular characters and how they work, this gives them a chance to hang out and inhabit their world. Readers project themselves into the story. And it's precisely because of this intimate connection and investment that they begin to care. It's hard to have empathy if you don't care. Care and empathy are synonymous. And books, because of that longer time that we spend with them, that more intimate nature, they invite us to have empathy, even with people who look, act, and live in circumstances that look nothing like ours. I really applaud this quality of books, and I profoundly believe that in reading and writing stories that go to the heart of the human experience, no matter where that is, that we make ourselves a slightly better world.
When we think of writing, when we think of being an author, the tendency from the outsider is that you are performing acts of addition. You're adding words, phrases, stories to a page. But sometimes the hardest part is the opposite. It's subtraction. It's choosing what not to write. Can you speak to this at all in your entire process?
Jeffrey, it's a great question. There's a lot I could say on this. Number one, there was an entirely different manuscript that I wrote on this book. When I was trying to stick more closely to the facts of Meyer and his expeditions, and it didn't work. It came really close. It had a lot of pretty sentences. It had a lot of interesting details. It had a lot of things, but it wasn't the thing. It wasn't the thing that I needed to write. So I learned that lesson the hard way. The agent didn't take it, and I found myself back on page 1. But as a historical fiction writer in general, your question is great. We nerd out. We spend, heaps of time. And we are personally so invested in this research that we can forget the reader is not yet invested to the degree we are. I also work, in addition with my own writing, I work with plenty of other writers, some of whom are historical writers. And we all hit this point where we cannot put in every detail. The details need to be in the service, and this includes the research, all of it, all the facts. It needs to be in the service of the story. The story is not in service of the facts. It's the difference, right, between nonfiction and fiction. So the details always have to be in the service of the story, which means that not all of them are going to be able to make it in. Why? Because they don't serve the story. And that can be hard. It's something that every historical research, every historical writer, right, suffers with their research. Is the stuff that you got to let go. But the last thing I would say on that is that with all writing, not just historical writers, but all writing, this is true. Because one of the great aspects of reading is not that everything is going to be told to you. Again, that is more how reading for information only works. We want to leave something for the reader. Readers are smart. They want to figure out things themselves. They want to play a little bit of the detective of any mystery that a story holds. And every story holds a mystery to some degree or another. We've got to leave them something for interpretation. So if we tell them everything including the significance, what to think. If we wrap up everything, and we really rob the reader of one of the joys of reading, we insult their intelligence. We have to give them some leeway to supply, right, the spaces between, right, the steps and the gaps that we give them.
So tell our listeners, viewers, what you're working on that's new that we can look forward to.
Well, I'm not going to give a timeline in terms of when it's going to be finished, but I am at work. I'm pretty far through a manuscript right now. I still have the historical bug. I am not setting it in any particular country, but I am setting it in an Eastern European-like country during the Cold War. And it concerns a family that has undergone some trauma with the invasion of their country. When I began the story, Ukraine had not yet been invaded. But back to our earlier questions, human beings, for better and often for worse, seem to have the same tendencies. So I think that this story will still feel very timely of how does one get over trauma and move forward? How does one navigate within cultures of fear and repression, right? These are subjects that interest me right now.
Allison Alsup, she's author of the book Foreign Seed. Allison, where can listeners, viewers find you online?
Yeah, so a couple of different places. I have a website out there, AllisonAlsup.com. Find information about the book and about me. I'm also out on Instagram, Allison Alsup, author. If you're interested in New Orleans Writing Workshop, which is a nonprofit that I have, we have a website as well. You can Google or search that. And we have Facebook and Instagram for that as well. If you're in the area, we offer workshops. I also work individually with writers in terms of developing their manuscripts. And I would like to encourage anyone who has an interest in historical fiction, if you're interested in checking out Foreign Seed, you can find that in any number of outlets, including Turner's own website. And I would encourage you to also check out your local independent bookstore.
Great. Allison Alsup, thanks for joining us here on Talk by Turner.
Talk by Turner, hosted by Jeffrey Colon. Watch and listen now wherever you enjoy podcasts.